We'll start soon. Okay, welcome to the webinar focusing on sports entrepreneurship. I'm Vlad Spencer. Thank you for being with us. I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C. Our co-moderator, Anata Devosyan, is based in Yerevan in Armenia. This webinar is part of the International Sports Programming Initiative, which is a program of the State Department Sports Diplomacy Division, and it's produced by World Learning and Digital Communication Network Global. A few years ago, we had an exchange program in Colombia, in Latin America, and it was part, that exchange, of an effort to support disadvantaged communities where gangs and violence were endangering and even ending young people's lives. The situation in the country was pretty bad at that time. We learned while planning for that program that the field bringing the country together, a common passion, was sports. Mostly football, but not only. Young people were passionate about this. Large communities were very passionate about sports. And in that context, preparing for the program, we met coaches and we met youth activists. And what we noticed was that while all of them were mastering the sports skill, they are lacking enough skills and know-how needed to put together sustainable organizations and viable programs and increase impact in those communities. And the idea that came out of our findings was a program called Sports Factory, which we implemented at that time in Colombia. And the organization resulting from that skill building program is still in existence, does exist in a city in Colombia. It is our wish to actually continue with this theme through this webinar. And the theme is developing entrepreneurial skills, hard skills, soft skills. And this is the inspiration for the webinar. Our guest speaker, Rohan, an accomplished entrepreneur in India with global experience in sports, in other ventures, who's focusing on very important aspects of entrepreneurship, including marketing and branding, and advocacy and understanding philanthropy. And I hope to have an opportunity with Rohan to go through all these topics. So first of all, Rohan, thank you so much for doing this. I'm sure that the information is going to be fascinating for our viewers. By now, you all know about Zoom. Many of you actually participated in previous webinars that we put together. You know that we value a lot, not only the information sharing, but also the networking aspect. We created a very large network since we started webinars during the pandemic. Since last March, over 1,500 people. Some of you are members of that network. And so please use chat to ask questions, to introduce yourselves, to post links that might be relevant for this topic. This for us is to some extent a test of a webinar that is different than what we've done before. So it's not a panel; it's only one speaker, and I hope to go more in depth in a variety of ways, and maybe eventually to develop a training module on sports entrepreneurship at some point in the future. So again, thank you for being with us. Thank you, Rohan, for participating and being the speaker. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vlad, and welcome, Rohan. I will just say your last name and what you do, because Vlad already introduced you very well. So our speaker today is Rohan Vyavaharkar. He's a director of marketing and communications in Omidyar Network, India. Rohan, I would like you to tell us about what you do in the network, and then we'll go to the questions.
Great. So, I mean, it's really not related to sport, but what I do at Omidyar Network India as Director of Marketing and Communications um, is looking after Omidyar Network India, which is an investment firm focused on social impact, and we work with bold entrepreneurs who help create a meaningful life for every Indian. We're a geo-focused entity that's sort of investing only in India, but we also have partner organizations like the Omidyar Network in the US and Luminate Group and Flourish Ventures, etc., which all sort of form something called the Omidyar Group. So in my remit, what I look after is the investment firm and sort of marketing and communications needs for the firm itself, as well as those of our investees and grantees. We invest in for-profit organizations as well as provide grants to nonprofits. And even after sort of advising and helping and sort of just guiding some of the investees and grantees that we have in our portfolio. So that's kind of what I do. And as you want, and I'm happy to talk about it more or less as the case may be.
We'll go with the questions. Now we see all the big teams, sports athletes, they all are involved in some kind of a marketing. And I would like to ask you, what do you think, how it's important to have a marketing strategy for all these big clubs, big athletes to go forward and to, showcase themselves?
Yeah, and look, I think, I mean, I think fundamentally what is starting to happen is people are realizing more and more that you cannot genuinely separate marketing as an entity outside of, outside of business, outside of sport, outside of, like outside of the traditional brand, right? So marketing itself, I mean, for me, whether you're a sports organization, whether you are a nonprofit, or whether you are a dog food company, for me the idea that you have to live the brand is, and if you're the founder or the CEO or the board, whoever you might be, like that brand has to come from within, right? You can't fake it. And that's the whole point. And I think that's where it sort of ties in so beautifully to sport, right? Like you can't really fake sport. You're either good at what you do, you're either passionate about what you do, or you're not, right? And at some point in time, you're going to get found out. And I think that's really what separates the overall sort of the good brands from the great brands and the greatest brands, right? And I think ultimately realizing that if you want to be one of those brands, you have to sort of merge into people's lives, right? And you have to become important to that, and really the goal then automatically becomes how do you integrate yourself into someone's lifestyle, right? How do you become a part of a life cycle of the consumer? How do you make sure that when a consumer thinks about football, and I know I'm going to lose half the room, and I mean soccer when I say football, but I'm probably going to lose half the room. But when I think of football, I'm going to think about Manchester United. That's because I've been a supporter since I was 5 years old, and this is way before the days of Alex Ferguson and all of that stuff, right? And I think for me that story really defines how a brand grows, right? Because when I became a Manchester United fan, it was not a listed company. They were not champions of Europe. They were not champions of England even, right? For that matter, I hadn't won the championship in 32 years. I mean, when they eventually did. So the point is that ultimately, the reason I stuck with Manchester United is not because they won all those trophies. Certainly that helped, but the whole idea of a brand sort of growing with you is because it appealed to me at a very seminal level, right? It became a part of my personality, right? It's one of the first things that people know about me. I mean, as we've got people on this call who'd never heard of me right before we began, and now they know I'm a Manchester United fan within 5 minutes of the call, right? And that's actually most of my conversations in real life. So I think just being able to think of a brand in a way that's actually integral to someone's life and ensuring, and not sort of ensuring, but sort of trying to become more and more relevant, right? I think is important. And you can do that so beautifully with sport, because sport is lifestyle, right? I've got the French Open on. I promise not to turn my head, but I know it's on there, right? So the point is that for me, that like those things are very important, because that's the things, those are the things that I've grown up with. So I think the idea really is, as a sports brand, as a sports team, as an athlete, right? How do you make yourself relevant? I mean, can you inspire people, right? Like can you inspire people with your story? So for take for example Neymar, right? Or Cristiano Ronaldo, right? Can you do that? Or can you show people how sport is an art form, right? Take for instance Roger Federer. Can you inspire people to become healthier? Can you give them a purpose, right? Nike comes to mind, right? And I think that the beauty of sport is that you have all these real life stories and real life drama that you can instantly tap into, right? And it's not fake, it's not invented, it's just real things that are happening. And because real sport is so, and when I say sport, I'm just as an aside, I'm not talking about WWE, but when you talk about sport, because the drama is happening in real time, it's got so many parallels with your own life. And then to be able to make those connections, I think, automatically. So I think it's about seeing those opportunities and those connections, and then, constantly drawing those bridges. And I know I've mentioned some global names, but I think it's true even domestically. There are some inspiring stories, right? Even in the back roads of Bombay, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I wanted to ask if, look, let's say somebody wants to open the new club. So what's the first steps towards marketing that club? And I think you can answer this question because the big clubs, we know how huge money they spend on the marketing and PR for their club. But for example, as you said, in Bombay, some small soccer team opening, and what we should do in order to make this club popular and include it in the community.
So great question, and I think if we take a step back, right? And I was trying to sort of think of this question, right? When you look at grassroots, so one objective or one goal of starting something that's at the grassroots is obviously going to be, be earning money, right? You can think of earning money as profitability or sustainability, right? Because I think that clarity is important, and I'll distinguish the two. So profitability means you're trying to make like a quick buck, right? Like you put in an investment and you're trying to earn returns. Sustainability is when you take a few dollars and you're trying to make that grow, not with the objective of exiting, but with the objective of creating a wider impact, right? And I think those are two very different objectives. So I think starting with that objective becomes critical, right? The second point really is why you, right? Like what is so special about you, right? Like I played cricket for a local club in Bombay, and the reason I sort of was naturally attracted to them was literally because they were closest to my house, right? And the point is that and to me that's a perfectly good enough reason, right? Because if you're giving a platform for local cricketers or local footballers or local volleyball players, I think whatever that purpose might be, I think that's important. And then really sort of and then at another level sort of saying that, hey, are we about poverty, are we about sort of the community? Are we about sort of giving aspirations to people and sort of letting them know that we will lift you out of poverty, for example? Or are we about being a recreational club, right? Are we about are we for the guys with the Audis and the Mercedes to sort of drive in, have an evening out, go and get a couple of beers? Are we that sort of club, right? And sort of knowing where you sit along that spectrum. But even in both of those, I think the earlier example of sustainability, I think is also common. So being able to answer that question, I think fundamentally is important. And once you've answered that question, then marketing is just telling that story. So just going back to saying, hey, look, we're your local club. We're here. If you want to have fun, we'll do that. And then automatically your product sort of starts to build around that, right? Because if you're going to be about lifting kids, like in India, we have, perhaps some of the others on the call might have heard of them. We have an organization called Magic Bus. They're a non-profit that works with underprivileged kids through the medium of sport, right? So through that, these children are able to sort of, they're able to play rugby, they're able to learn, they're able to play football. And not only that, but they're also getting life skills. They're able to learn English, right? And that's really their purpose, right? And the founder, who actually, Vlad and Anna, you should definitely have on here, and he's amazing. But his sort of purpose really is to be able to create a community that cares, and sport then just becomes the medium, right? And I think really, if you're able to answer those fundamental questions, I think the marketing becomes almost natural. And that's really how I see marketing, by the way, no matter what your brand, right, has to be a part of why you exist and what you do, right? And then it's really about identifying the tools. Like, if you're a community, if you are about the sort of really underprivileged community, then it's about going to the, it's about going to the local sort of, I don't want to call them slums, but you get the idea. Like, you going to the projects, right, and sort of working with the kids there. Or if it's about sort of the, the more privileged sort, it could be a social media sort of outreach campaign and promotion and sort of member acquisition campaign. But I think knowing why you want to do it and how you're going to do it, I think automatically helps define all.
Okay, great. I want to talk about a little bit about the women's sports, because now it's everybody wants to make it, more powerful, more vocal, and it's in some countries, in most of the countries, it's hard because of the traditions. Because like I'm working in Armenia in women football, and it's really getting harder and harder to make it popular and to marketing it, because it's a traditional society. So I want to ask you, how to make the social idea, like women rights, to empower the women, like using the sports to do it. So how you will market it, how you will make it stronger, these ideas of women empowerment using the sports.
Yeah, great question. And I've sort of struggled with that myself. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs in sport in India, and one of the things that we don't see enough of is women entrepreneurs in sport. And I think that's the fundamental issue, right? Because we don't really, and it's funny, right? Because we talk about women in sport when women are 50% of the planet. So we shouldn't really be talking about women in sport. It's like, if men are playing sport, women should be playing sport. So there really shouldn't be that sort of distinction. But there is, and the reason, and I think it's really about, you're right, Anna, in that there is a cultural barrier, right? And when I say cultural, I'm sort of using that as a catch-all for things like religion and social taboo and all of that. But I think I think the fundamental issue is that there aren't enough. There are too few, rather. There are some, but there aren't enough good role models in sport, right? And you see this effect. Like in India, we have Sania Mirza, who who really became in some sense, the vanguard of Indian women's tennis. And suddenly you could see that there were more girls interested, right? I mean, literally, like this girl, whether she wanted or not, single-handedly sort of raised the profile, and she made it okay. And I think it's really about finding those examples and sort of putting them center stage. Now, the problem is that even the media that would put them center stage, unfortunately, doesn't get it, because guess what? The men are sort of, controlling that space as well. And I think automatically that balance needs to shift. But I think fundamentally, the more women are sort of highlighted, because there are women doing some great stuff, like you're doing it in Armenia, and just the opportunity to be able to show that women can do the same thing that men can do. Like, I'll give you a classic example. My older daughter trains with the with the football captain, the women's football captain for my state, right? For the state that I belong with, and she, they have football training that they work on. And I think just by, and I'm, my daughter may become the next Mia Hamm, and she may not become the next, next whoever. But I think the objective of sort of showing her that is that me as a father wants to show her that, that men and women, there is no distinction. And automatically, I think if we're able to just have more women do stuff like that, and obviously, that, like, whether I like, as much as I hate to admit it, you will need men to support that sort of, development and growth. But I think if we're able to achieve both in inflection, there will be a lot, we'll see that change. But, and really, like, just to quickly answer the last bit of your question, like, the marketing of it is really about, again, just getting those stories out there. Because Sania Mirza didn't, or Saina Nehwal, who sort of revolutionized badminton in India, right? And this was when badminton really wasn't like, it wasn't that high profile a sport, but she really increased the profile, and then men followed on the back of that, right? And then the men became superstars because Saina Nehwal sort of came in and increased the profile. So I think finding those examples and then making showcases out of them, I think is really the first step. And then the next step next step is to continue doing that and sort of keep hammering on that point.
And what do you think, what is really missing there if, like, we don't have enough women entrepreneurs in sports and in the world? I mean, we see that US, they are, we take again the soccer as an example, but the current athletes and former players, they are trying to make it happen. They're fighting for equal rights. But as you said, there's something missing. And what you think is the most, missing part of that? We don't have enough women entrepreneurs.
Well, I think women entrepreneurs is not just a sports problem. We see that, and we see that in the world that I sort of represent now, right? In that women just don't seem to get the same opportunities that men do, and I think a lot of that has to do with, it's an attitudinal thing, and I don't mean to make any political statements here today, but I think it's really about sort of boardrooms changing themselves, right, and sort of accepting. I mean, there's enough evidence, there's enough data to show us that if there are more women board members, you will have stronger women leaders, and if you have stronger women leaders, you will hire more women in positions that will eventually rise to the CXO suite. And it's really that, it really sort of starts, and as much as you would like to think that this is about merit, it isn't, right? And it's about having some sort of top-down impact on the process, and really sort of, increasing women representation. Like I work with my manager, boss, whatever, is a woman, and she's, one of the most incredibly powerful women that I've worked with, frequently in the top business people in India, right, in the Forbes lists and all of that stuff. And I think what working with her has made me recognize is the fact that even in her position, her whole focus is on saying, how do we increase women representation at the top, and then subsequently, in the layers that sort of follow. And that's the same thing with VCs, right, and entrepreneurs. Because if there are more entrepreneurs who understand if there are more VCs who understand entrepreneurs, they're going to fund more entrepreneurs. And when that happens, because it's not like women don't have ideas, and they'll probably have better ideas than men in some cases, but it's simply because there is just a stronger male representation, and therefore the bias. And I think more often than not, it's, at least in the spaces that I work in, I don't think it's on purpose, but it exists, and we'd be blind to say it doesn't exist.
Yeah, great, thank you. So Vlad has questions now.
Sure. The audience does, but before that, Rohan, so other than the fact that you are already hired by the Armenian Football Federation to support their women, so we sent you the contract after the webinar. Yeah. So so one thing I would like to kind of summarize. So if you look, sports entrepreneur, what kind of skills a sports entrepreneur would need in order to create an organization that is, not only created but also sustainable? Actually, this idea of sustainability, I see a question here from Obiora, who says it's easy to create something, more difficult to make it last, to make it sustainable. So what type of skills a person like this needs to develop over time in order to be a good manager or coordinator of this type of venture?
So great question. Let's split that into two. And again, this is, let me caveat that by start by caveating this, saying these are obviously my views. And but I think if you sort of split that up, and one is starting the business. I think starting the business as a sports person, as an athlete, you probably already have the skills, right? Because you understand the sport, you understand what motivates you, and therefore you'll be able to pass on a lot of that motivation, the passion, to other people, right? Especially if you're playing a team sport, I think it's even easier because you understand how teams work and the dynamics of teams. So to be able to sort of, integrate and incorporate those learnings into running a company or starting off a company is easier than sort of sustaining it, which we'll come to in a second. So I think from starting idea, it's about having the idea. We spoke about this, we were talking a little bit earlier about having that purpose sort of defined and knowing exactly why you want to build, why you want to do what you want to do. And having that answer, I think, becomes important. Once you have that, then, building that team and all of that, the first sort of phase comes quite naturally. And you're right. And, it's hard to sustain things. And we see it all the time, right? Like, I mean, there used to be crazy statistics, which thankfully aren't true, but 9 out of 10 startups will shut down. I used to run a startup, I used to run a startup, and then I had my own startup. The startup that I was running, thankfully, is still running. So I can't be blamed for shutting it down. But my own startup, I did shut down, right? And there's several reasons for that, but that's not the point here. So I think but if you're sustaining something, I think the idea of sustaining a sports thing, I think ultimately goes to, how do I benefit the people who are directly getting impacted by this, right? Because I think far too often when we start a company, a lot of this becomes about the vision that I have, which is important as an entrepreneur, but it's really about, especially in sport, you're in service of someone else, right? Like, for example, if you're Manchester United, you're in service literally of the fans. As anyone familiar with Manchester United or English or European football will know, right? Like that's been underlined indelibly now. That's marked in every European club, right? So you're in service of the fans. If you are a local sports club, you are in service of the local community, right? And then sort of knowing and understanding their requirements and sort of building for that requirement, I think automatically becomes important. Because if you make, and this is what I was saying earlier as well, if you make yourself indispensable to someone's life, then you're achieving sustainability, right? It's the same thing. I mean, no matter what think of any great product that's lasted 20, 30, 40 years, right? It's because it's so integrated or integral to people's lives, and that's the reason it's lasted, right? And that could be true if like, think of IBM, right? Like IBM has pivoted so many times over the last, it's been in existence now close to 100 years, and they have they've constantly, I may be wrong, but they've been in existence for a long time, right? And they've pivoted so many times, right, doing different things continuously. That's because they're focused on the consumer. Who is, what does your consumer want, and how can we continue to serve them and remain relevant as a product, as an offering, as a service, right? And I think it's really that simple. Like, can we build something that is flexible? Can we build a team that's willing to be that flexible and sort of adapt to things that are changing around us, and really understanding, and can I build a team that I can trust in a way that actually will listen to the market and react to the market, right? And obviously, I mean, once you've built something, then and it's sort of starting to see some sort of traction, and like some sort of minimal has some sort of critical mass, I think then it's really about ensuring that you have a pulse of that market, right? Because sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So in addition to this, obviously, this emphasis on passion and serving, whatever target audience is extremely important. It's very important for us, when we do exchanges in public diplomacy, for example. It's the same thing. Is that sometimes, people are putting the means before the goals. It has to be goal oriented. That means, it needs to be that the means are actually adjusted to what you are trying to accomplish. And that's an important thing. It's kind of a simple thing that many people miss for whatever reason. But in terms of the kind of this lifelong training for somebody who enters entrepreneurship, so what would be those elements be for a young sports entrepreneur? What does he or she need to learn?
Yeah. So I mean, again, this has been my own experience. I think just one is, and these are almost sort of personal sort of attributes more than sort of what you need to learn, because what you need to learn at a skill sort of level would probably be things like finance and sort of hiring well, etc. But I think even more fundamental for me are the sort of personal traits, right? Like for me, humility is right up top, right? The ability to be able to say I'm wrong and to be able to just go back to the drawing board and say, okay, I screwed up, let me try again, right up there. Another one is just the ability to be able to ask for help, right? Because I think a lot of people think of entrepreneurship as saying, I'm going to do this myself, right? But guess what, buddy? If you have to cross the Pacific, you can't do it with one oar. You know what I mean? And if you're really trying to create sea change, you're not going to be able to create with, you're not going to be able to do it. So I think the ability to ask for help. And the third is knowing when to stop, right? There is, I strongly believe in the fallacy of sunken cost, right? Because it's, and it's someone who's been to Las Vegas will also know this, right? Like when you're sitting on a slot machine, like, okay, let me throw in one more quarter, right? Because it's going to be this one that hits the jackpot. But it never really is. And it's the same thing, right? Like at some point you have to know when you need to pull out and then say, okay, look, I made some mistakes. Let me learn from them. Now let me go back in. And obviously we talk a lot about failures and we talk a lot about, missed opportunity. But I think even to be able to admit that you failed, I think requires humility, because you're not going to have all the answers. And I think knowing that it's okay, right? And the other sort of, so the corollary to that is also then making sure that you know what your support system is. Because I had my own company and I was running someone else's company, like I was saying, and it can get very lonely, right? Because, and we talk a lot about mental health in these days, but I think just the fact that a lot of people will simply on some days, including those closest to you, will simply not know how you're feeling, right, is a very real thing. And to be able to sort of just know that, hey, I may not be able to go to my wife, or I may not be able to go to my mom and have a conversation, but there's someone else I should be able to sort of connect with or talk to. And having that sort of a support system, I think, becomes essential. And then really comes up, then more about the skills, about things like what are the real essential things that I need to know in order to be able to run this business, right? So I think like having your finances, and that's where I made a mistake, right? When I was running my own business, where we simply just, we thankfully didn't run out of, we realized before that we were going to run out of money. So I was able to sort of make sure that everyone working for us was able to get a good severance package. But we could have been so much more, right? But that's because I wasn't paying attention to the finances. And so one is finances. The other is also just sort of really being a domain expert. Don't kid yourself if you're not a domain expert. Like, and if you're not a domain expert, bring in a domain expert, right? So that goes back again to the humility to sort of know that, hey, if I'm not good enough, let me bring in somebody who can actually do that, right? And you might have the idea, you might have the passion, but guess what? If you're not a coach, if you're not a grade A coach, you're not, either you go get the skills, you go get the certification, or you bring in a grade A coach and then you become the business development guy or whatever, right? So I think just sort of recognizing those sort of aspects, and Vlad, I don't know if that sort of is a holistic enough answer, but
definitely lots of food for thought. So I would like now to go. I see the Chukwemeka, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing for sure your name, raise his hand. So one thing, Rohan, about them, Chukwemeka and his brother, actually, Omidyar, they created an amazing American football program in Nigeria. In disadvantage area, in a challenge area in many ways. And so they have this program. And I know that Chukwemeka asked the question on the chat about fundraising for nonprofits, but let's see what he has to say. So please, very, very briefly, Chukwemeka, so unmute.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone from Nigeria. My name is Amadi Chukwemeka, and I have a question, for Rohan. Please, I want to know, how do you go about, attracting finances, funds, for a nonprofit, knowing fully well that you have companies around you that are not having obligations to, finance sports. How do you go about raising funds for a nonprofit? That's one question. The other question is, what do you make out, of your staffing for your nonprofit? Do you capitalize on volunteer force, or do you look more on paid, staffs? What way best to go? Thank you.
So Amadi, where in Nigeria are you from?
Yeah, I'm from the south. I'm from Imo State, but I'm resided in Zaria, Kaduna.
Okay.
But right away now, I'm talking to you from Calabar.
Okay.
That's Cross River State.
No, I spent some time in Kano, by the way. So
wow,
north,
that's about 1 hour 30 minutes from Kano to Zaria. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Great. So interesting questions. I'll answer the first one first. In that, how do you really attract funds for non-profit organizations working in sports, right? And I recognize in a country like, because I live there, I can tell you that there aren't that many sort of folks who'd be willing to, put money into non-profit ventures, right? And I think it's a tough one, but I think it's really about sort of, in some sense, identifying just why you do what you do in that, right? Like, let's say, for example, if you are working in, you said Kaduna, so let's go with that. If you have, if you have street kids in Kaduna, and you are, you're building a football program, right? And saying that the goal is to be able to provide 10 of them employment as football players in 10 years' time, right? And maybe then it becomes about sort of creating a package. And again, I'm going to try and answer this with an example, because obviously the cases will be very specific, but sort of creating a package and saying that, look, if hey, industrial group, whatever, from Lagos or wherever, saying that we're going to create this program, and if 10 of these kids make it to the national squad or make it to Premier League or wherever, we are going to make sure that they are signed as your athletes for the next 15 years. But what we need you to do is take care of 40 kids, which obviously will not, because the returns will be so great for those 10 kids. We want you to take care of these 40 kids that we have in the program today for the next 5, 7, 10 years, right? And this is how much it's going to cost. Are you in or are you out? And I think by doing that, you're sort of making them a part of your journey and sort of making them a part of your success story, but you're also then ensuring sustainability, right? And that's kind of, that's sort of the way also nonprofits really operate, even in India, like saying that, hey, this is our journey, and this is the journey that we're on. Do you believe in this eventual vision that we will, like, for example, we, as Omidyar Network India, we provide grants to an organization called Dream a Dream, right? Amongst several things they do, they use sport, and Magic Bus, the other organization that I was mentioning, they use sport as a way of providing life skills to kids and underprivileged kids. And the reason why funders give them funds is because for them, it becomes an opportunity. One is for branding, because it makes them look good, and the other is really because if you're able to upskill a lot of people, even if it's life skills, if you're able to upskill a lot of people, you're essentially contributing to the employable workforce. And if you have a more productive workforce that has better life skills, chances are you're going to be able to hire from a better pool, right? So it's about taking the sort of metropic view, like the long-term view on things, and really then connecting that with what a potential funder might want to achieve. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. I learned something, taking them along in the journey. That's great. My second question, please. Like I said, I have it. What do you make out of your workforce? Do you capitalize on volunteer force? Do you go on paid staffs, working on non-profits? What's the best way to go?
Yeah, and look, I mean, there is no easy answer, Amadi, but I think my honest answer to this is, if you want to build something that's powerful and strong, you have to hire the best, right? And you have to therefore pay them well. I mean, make sure you may not be able to pay them 100% corporate salary, but even if you paid somebody who has passion, because obviously most people who work in nonprofits will automatically have a certain amount of passion. And if you're able to hire somebody with that level of passion, he or she will probably work for 60 to 70. I mean, I'm just making that number up, but you know what I mean? Like, they'll probably work for, a number that's not 100%. But I think the goal really is to be able to offer them that 100%, because that translates into retention, that translates into growth, that translates into them being able to really help you grow the organization, right? And really have ownership in the mission and the vision of the organization. So I think volunteers are good, but I think if you really want to grow and you really want to create a strong organization, I think it's the real way to go is creating a paid team. And again, look, I think the thing is, with passion, you'll realize that you can multiply the hours and you can multiply the energy if you have genuine passion, right? So you might be able to hire 3 people but do the work of 17. You know what I mean? So I think it's, and of course, I mean, and assuming that you pay them well, right?
Okay, so great question. One thing, Chukwemeka and Obiora, that I forgot to tell you is that from a previous webinar where you were the speakers, there was a gentleman who actually listened from Sri Lanka, and he wants to introduce American football to Sri Lanka. Wow. So we are going to talk a little bit, and it's interesting, how these global connections work. Obviously, in Rohan's neighborhood, and the Minister of Sports happens to be a former rugby player. So there are some connections there. So we need to continue to talk about, but it reminded me of this as an interesting, extension of these webinars, the networking component. Now, Bruno Lassi from Capo Verde asked a question, and I'd like him to maybe ask a question on the mic. And so he, his work is more similar to an agent discovering talent in over there. And I think that the question is mostly about how to build a network. But let me ask Bruno to ask himself. I'm sure he's going to be much better than what I understood from the question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. But Mr. Vladimir said it well. It's exactly that. I'm on the verge of creating a sports management company. I want to be a sports agent, and it's exactly that. I want to know maybe 2 things. First, how to approach a client, how to approach a talent that I identified, and how to create a network with the clubs, because our reality here is I want to take the talent abroad. So it's not for the local, the national market. It's to export talent. So I would like your help, your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. And I mean, I genuinely don't. I'm not really sort of familiar. I've worked with a lot of talent agencies and managers and thing, but I think the goal is really especially if you're talking about sort of taking them overseas, it's, to my mind, and the most successful ones that I've seen are really the ones sort of who invest time in the community, right, and who sort of really get to know the market super well, right, and I think the because that's really when you will be able to, and I can use the example of cricket, right, where I used to play the sport, pro, semi-pro kind of level, and where we would have these sort of agents, and being able to sort of come in and really identify the people who are good, and then the people who are going to take it to the next level, and sort of and almost sort of creating an ecosystem, because you can't, the point is you'll maybe have the 3 or 4 who can leave Cabo Verde, but there's got to be about 35 people who you're going to need to sort of sustain the ecosystem, and you're going to have to be fair to them as well, right? Because otherwise what happens is then Bruno becomes the mercenary, where he's not interested in the people who are never going to make it to the top, but ultimately, to be able to sort of help develop that network, you're going to need those 35 people, because some of them might go on and become coaches, some of them might go on and become scouts, some of them might go and become sort of sports managers, or run sports teams. So I think that those sort of relationships, and that, that's also the whole idea of networking, right? So but I think that the goal really is, if you're good enough, you'll identify the 2 or 3 on the top anyway, right, and the ones that you want to oversee. But I think it's really about how do you then create that ecosystem that'll then sustain itself, right? And those are the best, and like I said, the best managers in the business are the ones who they aren't the ones who know, like they aren't the ones who know Ronaldo, but they are the ones who sort of know the kit man and at Real Madrid, for example, right? Because the kit man at Real Madrid is watching the kids at the academy as well, right? And he's like, oh, this guy's good, that guy's good, whatever. But my point is that really sort of understanding how the process of sort of talent works, and knowing sort of how each one sort of contributes to that value chain, I think is important. So and again, unfortunately, I've never really been on the talent side of this, on the management side of talent. Just worked with talent and talent managers, but I hope that gives you some sort of insight.
Oh, you've definitely helped. Just the second question. And with clubs, the interaction with clubs or the network with clubs, how to approach them?
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I think the and again, you should probably talk to, there's obviously people far more educated and articulate about this than I am, but I think it's really about sort of, again, going through the paces, right? Like, you don't arrive, like very few people are Leo Messi who gets signed up with Barcelona FC at 13, right? It's really about sort of, going to Vitesse, then going, then going to Rotterdam, then going to sort of, Blackburn, and then sort of making it to the Premier League. So I think the, it's really about sort of building your networks, but then starting at those smaller clubs. Like I think what's important for any business, as it is with any business, is early wins, right? Early sort of scoring those early goals, right? Say, hey, I've been able to place 4 players with this club or that club, or even if it's in Ukraine, right? Or even if it's in some, like a slightly lower league, that's okay. But just sort of being able to say that I have professional athletes on my roster already.
I'm sure that Anna and the Armenian Football Federation noticed that there's a future agent in the room. So as Rohan said, that means, the idea is early successes and go to places that are not necessarily top, but build towards that. And Anna knows than me, obviously, the fact that they work with agents, and they actually launch many careers at that level that eventually get to good places. So good luck, Bruno. Good luck, Bruno. Now I mentioned Anna, so I know that she has some of the questions that came through registration, maybe. Anna?
Yeah, and here we have in the chat question from Florence. Florence, can you ask your question?
Yes, thank you. My question is, what would be the basic requirements for starting a community-based sport organization that can help reduce crime in the community? If you have identified there's a problem in your community, in a certain community, and you realize there are many young people, they are idle, and you want to engage them so that you can reduce the rate of crime in that community, what should be the basic requirements?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, that's a tough one, Florence, because I think the basic requirement is I mean, let's assume it's football or or cricket for that matter. I think the basic requirement is having a venue that's away from where they are, right? Because the few sort of intervention programs that are sports based that I've worked with are or volunteered with are really the one common factor in all of them is that they're physically removed from the community in some sense, right? Like it's not to say that it's in another city or another part of town, but just like it's not necessarily just in that neighborhood. And the reason I think that's important is because it's literally that club or community community team or whatever becomes almost a gateway to the outside world, right? So I think that physical separation, even however slight it might be, I think is important. That's number one. Number two is really sort of having a few strong personalities who sort of represent the values that you want this community venture to represent in that community, right? What I mean by that is, having those two strong girls who'll provide the guidance, because let's assume this is you running a program, and you as the outsider is always going to be seen as somebody who's sort of talking to them from outside the community. But for someone, having an ambassador or two within that cohort itself, I think automatically provides far more relevance and also provides a much greater sort of validation to the idea that of building that community. So I think being able to those two things automatically, I think are top of mind and are very important. But I think the other sort of thing is then being able to provide those kids some sort of common purpose, right? And there was a boy who I met a few years ago, and literally his coach, who was the guy who sort of put this team together, volleyball team together, told him, I want us to go and win a tournament, right? And that was it. Like that was the only thing. If you win us a tournament, we'll buy you new clothes or we'll buy you a new jersey or whatever. Like there was some sort of payoff, but it wasn't a big payoff. And because they said that they wanted to go and win tournaments, like all of them just sort of kept pushing each other to the point that they didn't have time for anything else, let alone crime, right? And they were just always on the court, always sort of just practicing, and what he said was that basically that just and then eventually they did win a tournament, right? Or they finished second or something like that. But then by that point it really didn't matter, because they realized that they had moved so far away from everything else that was happening around them. And they had achieved things that they had never imagined that they would achieve. And I think, again, I don't mean to overstate this, but I think that genuinely is the power of sport, right? Because it elevates you to something so much more than just your than just you're sort of giving into your social environment, right? And it's very hard, it's not easy, right? So if you're already thinking about this, if we're doing something like this, I mean, like you're already doing far more than I ever will or I ever have. So commendations on that. But I think just the act of sort of getting them to think about the possibilities, I think is what is a big step in that journey out of crime.
Yeah, and you know, one thing I could tell you is that the example I gave it initially, the program in Colombia, was basically about this. And one thing we learned throughout that program was to be able, in terms of kind of skills to develop by the entrepreneur, is to develop a kind of a stakeholder coalition. So it's not only the program itself, but actually this coalition that actually is helping with the other aspects. Because at the end of the day, you know, in any given program, the person is going to be through the program, but then after that goes back home. So it has to be an integrated effort. It has to be involved family, schools, you know, even local politicians we did in Colombia. They are all significant in actually building this coalition to fight this this very you know, bad phenomena. Now I see Brett said something. I don't know, Brett, could you unmute your microphone or be on camera and just, you know, very briefly, you know, repeat what you said in the chat, because it's interesting and relevant. If you could hear me, Brett.
Sorry about that. I was still looking up some stuff to send through. So the UNODC, it's around organized crime and those sorts of things. They've got a lot of resources around sport and crime prevention. The Australian government used to have some good stuff on their clearinghouse, but I've just looked there and unfortunately that seems to be removed from the website. The Victorian government's got some good stuff, and I know Canada, maybe the True Sport program or something like that. So there's some really good examples from around the world, but these are just the ones that come to mind off the top of the head.
Definitely, thank you. Where are you from, Brad?
I live in Perth, Western Australia, but originally from Melbourne.
Wow, thank you for watching so late. I think it's, I don't know what time it's there.
Yeah, I apologize. I actually joined late, so apologies to all for that.
Thanks for being with us. Okay, Anna, so more questions?
I just want to ask, because we live now in digital age and mostly during the COVID, let's talk about the role of the social media in building the organizations or building the, you know, the marketing of the club or PR of the club. So what do you think, how it is important to have all these channels and to be active in all the social media channels?
Yeah, and great question, and I think the role that social media plays is really about, like, you know, linked to what we were talking about earlier, is about how does what is the role that social media plays in your community or in your target group, right? In my view, like, for example, if you work with street kids, having something on social media is really then aimed towards fundraising, right? Not really so much about building that community of street children, right? So knowing what you're using the social media channels for is important, and then sort of identifying you know, what each sort of channel is for. Because I think the one thing to recognize is, and which is true of each one of us on this call, right? Like, we don't have time. Like, I choose to use LinkedIn and Twitter in my professional and personal life, right? I don't have time for Instagram. I don't have time for Facebook. I don't have time for Snapchat, or, you know, we don't have TikTok in India, but if we did, I wouldn't have time for it, right? So I think the point is that we have to really know where our audience is, and once you've chosen that, sort of knowing who we're going to talk to and what we're going to talk to them about, right? So if you are Manchester United, for example, it makes sense for you to be on Instagram because your fans will be on Instagram. It makes sense for you to be on Twitter because your fans will be on Twitter, and it, you know, and it makes sense for you to be on Facebook because your fans will be on Facebook, right? But the fact is that you're very clearly then talking to the fans. You're not going to be talking to investors on, you know, on either of those channels, right? Because you're probably going to be doing that over email or whatever else, right? So I think having that sort of clarity in terms of what channel you want to use and how, you know, who you want to talk to on each one of those channels. I mean, again, it might be rudimentary for you know, for a lot of people, but I think just sort of breaking it down into first principles is really helpful, because ultimately it's that's the whole sustainability part that we were talking about, right? Like, because once you've built the community, you can sort of start to sustain it by talking on the right channels and sort of creating it. But I think if you're looking at growing something from social media, then it's really about sort of, you know, having a good product. Let's assume that for a second. But then it's again about creating, you know, content that's inspiring, but also very faithful to your brand purpose, right? And sort of knowing, like, telling that story of why you do what you do. I think that becomes important. And you know, let's take the example of the Ahmadi brothers, right? For example, if they're building this story of American football in Nigeria, then it's really about, you know, images, pictures, stories of kids from Lagos, from Kaduna, from, you know, from Jos, having, you know, taking to American football and playing some American football, or sort of, you know, stories of people who might be going to America on a sports scholarship, right, to an American university. So sort of being able to tell those kind of stories and really create that relevance to your audience, I think becomes important. But again, just principally knowing who you want to talk to and why you want to talk to them, and therefore sort of having, it's almost like, don't let the medium define the message, but let the message tell you what medium to go on to, right?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think Chokameka raised 10. Do you have more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in concerning the social media stuff, because my experience, you know, working and trying to develop the sport out here, I have opportunity to visit some companies, and what they first ask you is, what's your social media, you know, activities? How many people do you have, you know, following what you're doing? They want to see what's the fan base like. You know, when you come up to social media, they want to see how many people log into the site. Probably that gives them an idea if to sponsor or not, because so if they are going to try to support you, they want to see that, okay, actually people are coming into your social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and there are a lot of traffic in there, and that helps them, you know, to be able to market themselves. So I think, you know, in the present day, you know, social media is a great tool to be able to build upon, and then also to attract some of all these great companies, especially from what I have as my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuku. So one question, maybe before we close the webinar, that was full of interesting ideas. You know, let's talk a little bit about this COVID and or post-COVID. So Rohan, you know, when you talk about the you know, entrepreneurship in general, this type of initiative, this type of programs, what you do, what our viewership does, what changes do you foresee as we hopefully leave this pandemic behind? Rohan, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, wow. I mean, you need a crystal ball for that one. But I think the sorry, can we just take? I was just looking at the questions. Actually, there's a question from Eric Bisco.
Yeah.
About you know, keeping sponsors involved in during the time of gang wars in Haiti. And
Okay.
yeah, and yeah, I mean, Eric, I think I think this is actually where you know, you need to have an honest conversation with the sponsors and really understand why they might want, you know, because it's very clear why you're keeping the children off the street. And maybe one way to do it is actually turn it into a marketing opportunity for the brands themselves, and say that, hey, can we start to think of ways to tell the story of how you're supporting us, right? And you've probably got some archival footage, and you've probably got some of these ideas or some of these sort of testimonials or whatever from the past, and really make it into branded and sort of flip the table and turn it into branded content, where you can maybe work with the sponsors themselves and create things about, like, this is why we invest in sport, this is why we invest in the future of Haiti, whatever, and sort of start to tell those stories that make them look good in return. And that way you're not sort of dependent on having sport on ground, but rather sort of using the sports that they've already helped create, and then telling that story instead. But if it's a question of getting potential sponsors, yeah, that's probably a tougher question to answer, and something that will need like a very specific sort of case study and response. So I hope that's hopeful, though.
So now getting back to the crystal ball.
Yes.
So do you think that this year and a half, as difficult, as hard, tough, tragic it was, did you learn anything that is useful for the future? Did you learn anything that is useful for your future as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think the number one thing was, this we used to like, we would talk a lot about valuation, right? Or sort of thing. And I think valuation is not as important as unit economics. I think that's been my number one learning, right? Like, just unit economics sort of links back to sustainability. That's number one. And number two is, I think, just having a really strong sense of adaptability. Just ensuring that, I mean, ultimately, if you're going to be if you are resilient, the number one thing you need to be is adaptable, and sort of, I mean, all of this humility and all of those things we were talking about, of course, but I think just adaptable to the situation. And I think that's really, those are two things how sort of, I think entrepreneurship will change in, post-COVID. Like, one is just sort of looking at fundamentals and sustainability and unit economics. And the second is sort of understanding the, the value of, I mean, we talk about pivot, like, especially in the Silicon Valley, right? We use the term pivot as a very sort of fanciful, almost like this romantic sense. But it's not like, post-COVID, like in the COVID era, it's changed dramatically, right? What you mean by pivot, because it's literally companies that have had to go from feet on street models to completely online overnight, right? So it's almost that sort of, having that sense of adaptability, I think becomes important. And specifically to sport, if I can just take 2 more minutes, I think is, I think what's also happened is people have realized that sport is really, sport is really just is so much more about fans and so much more about passion, right? Because really the reason why, and I, I'm sorry if I'm using too many English Premier League examples, but the reason why the soccer leagues in Europe came back to the stadium, right, and played even without the fans, was actually for the fans, right, in some sense, right, to be able to sort of, I mean, yes, it was about revenue, and yes, it was about, TV deals, but and broadcast deals, but it was as much about the fans themselves, right? Because the whole time the conversation was about, it doesn't feel right without the fans in the stadium. And I think just the power of the fans, I think, has now been indelibly etched in the sort of collective psyche of sports teams, right? The same thing happened with in American sport, in the Big Four. So I think that's really sort of given us a flavor of the power of the fans and the communities that exist outside the stadia. And I think that's really what will change, and you'll see that equation sort of changing even more drastically going forward.
And probably the failure of the Super League is also an argument in relation to what it
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
How did you look at that? Is it a communication failure, or it was a substantive failure?
Well, I think it was an idea that it was just a poorly thought out idea, right? You had teams that finished 9th and 10th being put into a league that they could not get relegated from. That just, I mean, that's not real sport. That's not how, I mean, even if Manchester United was a permanent member of that, I want to see them threatened by relegation to be able to say, hey, you know what, I need to pick my game up, and I really need to sort of push myself, right, to be able to make it back to the top. And this is not good enough, right? But what's the motivation? I mean, right now, you have teams fighting for third spot and fourth spot, and that's still a fight. But if tomorrow, if you knew that your place in the Super League was guaranteed, you wouldn't care if you finished 6th or 7th even, right? But your fan still cares, right? Like as a player, you may not care, but your fan still cares. So I think the failure is because the fans suddenly realize, saying that, hey, you're talking about the fans on the one hand, and you're telling us that you miss us in the stadia, but on the other hand, you're not really listening to us.
Yeah. It was, it was a fascinating happening, because it showed, as you said, that means, the fact, or it reminded us, what sports is all about. That means, it is about the fans, it is about the communities, it is about the people. So, Rohan, thank you so much for being with us. That means, it has been great. Eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to develop some kind of a, more systematic training module on in relation to entrepreneurship, and we'll keep you posted on that. But in the meantime, we wish you well. We are grateful that you took the time to be with us. Also considering the situation in relation to COVID in India, and we wish you well. And family, friends, community. To have this pandemic behind us as quickly as we can. For the rest of the audience, thanks for being with us. Just a reminder that this has been a webinar sponsored by the International Sports Programming Initiative of the State Department, and produced by World Learning and Digital Communication Network. We'll be back, probably we'll take a break for a few weeks, but we'll be back hopefully at some point in July, hopefully before the Olympics. We all hope that, we'll have the Olympics this year. And the topic hopefully at that time will be something related to the upcoming Olympics. So stay safe, be well, and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Bye.